April 7, 1945. Japanese fighter pilots scrambled into the morning sky expecting another wave of lumbering American bombers. But instead, they were met by something far more dangerous: sleek silver P-51 Mustangs. Fighters no one thought could reach Japan. In that moment, everything changed. The rules of aerial combat the Japanese had relied on for years collapsed in an instant, and the war over the homeland would never be the same. By the spring of 1945, Japan was a nation staggering under relentless attack. Almost every night, B-29 superfortresses droned overhead, unleashing firebombs that turned entire neighborhoods into oceans of flame. Tokyo, Nagoya, Kobe, cities once thought untouchable, were reduced to ash and twisted steel. Factories sputtered, transportation networks faltered, and ordinary citizens lived in constant fear of the next siren. This was not the war Japanese leaders had promised, one where the divine winds would protect the homeland. Instead, it was a daily test of endurance as the country bled under the weight of American air power. For Japan's pilots, the skies had once offered an arena of pride. Early in the war, the Zero fighter ruled the Pacific, feared for its agility and deadly reach. But by 1945, that reputation had crumbled. The Zero was hopelessly outmatched by newer American designs, its paper-thin armor and weak engine no match for aircraft like the Hellcat and Corsair. The war had become a slow grind downward. Every month brought fewer veterans returning from missions, more hastily trained recruits stepping into cockpits, and less fuel available to give them practice before battle. Yet one factor still gave Japanese defenders a narrow lifeline: proximity. American bombers had to fly from the distant Mariana Islands, journeys of nearly 1,500 miles. That meant Japanese fighters could intercept them only briefly, striking hard before retreating back to friendly fields. It wasn't victory, but it was survival. A way to at least blunt the impact of each raid. This fragile balance allowed Japan to believe its defenses still mattered. All of that changed in March 1945, when American engineers carved runways into the volcanic rock of Iwo Jima. Suddenly, the skies above Japan were within reach not only of bombers, but also of fighters. The defenders just didn't know it yet. The P-51 Mustang was never meant to terrify Japanese pilots. Born in 1940 for Britain, it began as a modest design with unimpressive performance at high altitude. On paper, it was nothing special. But when engineers paired its airframe with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, everything changed. The Mustang became fast, agile, and, above all, capable of extraordinary range. In Europe, this turned the tide of the air war. Squadrons of Mustangs escorted bombers deep into Germany, swatting down the Luftwaffe until Hitler's skies belonged to the Allies. By 1944, pilots called it the best all-around fighter of the war. But Europe was one thing, the Pacific was another. Here, distances stretched across endless ocean, and single-engine fighters had always been dismissed as impractical for long-range escort. One spark plug failure, one fuel miscalculation, and the pilot would vanish forever into the waves. For American planners, this left a dangerous gap. The B-29, as advanced as it was, could not protect itself against swarms of Japanese interceptors. Its machine guns helped, but losses mounted with each mission from the Marianas. Without escorts, the bomber offensive risked stalling. The answer came from Iwo Jima. Though tiny and fiercely contested, the island gave the U.S. a critical forward base just 650 miles from Tokyo. From its black sand runways, Mustangs fitted with long-range drop tanks could make the round trip barely. It was a gamble on engineering, fuel management, and sheer nerve. Yet once achieved, It promised to transform the war. For Japanese commanders, the very idea seemed absurd. No one believed a single-engine fighter could escort bombers that far. It defied the logic of range and endurance. That confidence would shatter on April 7, 1945, when the first Mustangs appeared in Japanese skies, flying farther than anyone thought possible, and proving that even the homeland was no longer beyond reach. The morning of April 7th dawned crisp and clear over Honshu. Mount Fuji stood like a sentinel, its snow-capped peak visible even from miles away. For Japanese pilots climbing into their cockpits, it felt like just another desperate sortie against the dreaded B-29s. They had fought this battle countless times before: scramble, intercept, strike hard, then retreat to preserve what little strength remained. But this day would break that familiar rhythm. As the bombers drew closer, something caught their eyes. These weren't just the lumbering giants they had grown used to ambushing. Sleek silver fighters were flying alongside them, their long noses glinting in the sun. Pilots blinked in disbelief. It had to be a mistake, some trick of the light. Yet the shapes grew clearer, unmistakable. These were single-engine fighters, but not Zeros or Franks. They were American. They were Mustangs. Panic rippled through Japanese radio chatter. Controllers barked orders, but confusion reigned. No one believed such an aircraft could have made the journey. The very idea defied their training, their assumptions, even the laws of fuel consumption. And yet, here they were, darting across the sky with ease, their wings gleaming like knives. For the Americans, it was a different kind of moment. Pilots of the 15th and 21st Fighter Groups had trained for months, their Mustangs modified with fuel tanks and hardened for long missions. As they closed in on the bomber formations, the coastline of Japan appeared beneath them. It was a real spectacle, one pilot recalled, a line of silver ships stretching for miles, with Fuji watching over us. Then came the clash. Japanese fighters rose in scattered groups, but their old tactics failed instantly. Diving in on bombers left them exposed to Mustangs waiting like hawks. Breakaways and hit-and-run passes turned deadly as P-51s matched their speed, climbed higher, and cut them down. By the end of the day, Americans claimed 21 enemy aircraft destroyed for the loss of just 2 Mustangs. Numbers alone told the story. The balance of air combat had tilted, and the defenders knew it. For Japanese pilots, this was not just another mission. It was a revelation. The enemy could now fight them over their very homeland, on terms the Japanese no longer controlled. The outcome of that first encounter wasn't just about shiny new airplanes. It was about tactics, training, and technology colliding in ways that exposed how far Japan had fallen behind. American pilots fought with a method honed in Europe. They flew in disciplined groups, covering one another and exploiting the Mustang's ability to dive, climb, and extend away at will. A Japanese fighter making a pass on a B-29 could no longer expect a quick escape. A P-51 could slash down from altitude, unleash its 6.50 caliber guns, and climb away before the Japanese even turned. Combat was now dictated by American pilots choosing when to strike, not by Japanese pilots dictating terms. Training told the rest of the story. By 1945, the United States had perfected a system. Rotate experienced flyers home to train new recruits, keep the pipeline flowing, and send replacements overseas already seasoned. Japan had the opposite problem. Veterans were dying faster than they could be replaced. New pilots often took to the air with only a handful of hours in real combat machines, flying aircraft built from dwindling materials and fueled with increasingly poor quality gasoline. Against seasoned American aviators in the best fighter of the war, the gap was devastating. Logistics mattered too. The Mustang was a rugged machine built for endurance. Its engine could take punishment and still deliver speed. Its radios gave precise coordination. And its long legs meant American pilots could conserve energy instead of burning themselves out on frantic dashes. Meanwhile, Japanese aircraft were often patched together with wood, fabric, and whatever metals could still be smelted in a starving economy. Each engagement was more than just a duel of skill. It was a collision of two industrial realities. The result was a widening gap in losses. Even when Japanese pilots fought bravely, their odds shrank. The tactics that had once worked against bombers, dash in, fire, break away, now spelled disaster against fighters designed to counter them. By the spring of 1945, every Japanese sortie was less about victory and more about survival. The shock of the Mustang's arrival forced Japanese commanders into a corner. Old tactics no longer worked, but surrender was unthinkable. So they turned to desperate measures. Ideas once dismissed as extreme now became doctrine. Ramming, for example, had once been a last resort, the kind of act carried out only when a pilot had no other choice. By mid-1945, it was formalized as a legitimate strategy. Pilots were trained to use their aircraft as weapons, diving directly into bombers or escorts when conventional guns could not guarantee results. Manuals began emphasizing the honor of sacrificing the plane, and sometimes the pilot himself, to take down just one enemy. Alongside this came the introduction of newer Japanese aircraft. Fighters like the Kawanishi N-1K, George, or the Ki-84 Frank showed flashes of potential. In the hands of surviving veterans, these planes occasionally managed to surprise Mustangs, scoring hard-won victories that echoed through Japanese propaganda as proof that hope still existed. But for everyone's success, there were many more defeats. Shortages of materials meant only limited numbers of these aircraft could be built, and fuel restrictions crippled training for the pilots assigned to them. Meanwhile, the physical quality of Japan's warplanes continued to decline. Aluminum, once plentiful, became scarce, replaced with wood, fabric, even bamboo in certain components. Engines, starved of proper metals and running on fuel cut with poor substitutes, coughed and sputtered at high altitudes. The contrast was stark. American machines rolled off assembly lines by the thousands, each one standardized and reliable. Japanese machines looked increasingly like improvisations, barely airworthy in some cases. Still, Japanese pilots flew. Their courage was never in question. But courage alone could not stop the tide. Every mission became an exercise in survival rather than dominance. The once feared defenders of the Pacific skies were now locked in a struggle where every edge, technology, tactics, and resources tilted against them. And then, just as they tried to adapt, nature delivered a blow even worse than the Mustangs. June 1st, 1945. On paper, it was supposed to be just another long-range escort mission. Mustangs from Iwo Jima, guarding B-29s on their way to Osaka. Nearly 150 fighters took off, each packed with fuel in every tank and drop tank, prepared for the 8-hour odyssey across ocean and enemy skies. But what lay ahead wasn't a Japanese ambush. It was the weather. Towering walls of cloud loomed near the target area, stretching miles high, swallowing formations whole. Once inside, the carefully drilled groups of P-51s shattered. Radios crackled with confusion, navigators struggled, and individual pilots suddenly found themselves alone in a sky turned white and blind. Flying instruments kept them alive, but orientation slipped quickly. Some burned precious fuel weaving through turbulence. Others strayed miles off course. For the Japanese watching from radar stations and airfields, it was a strange sight. American planes weren't falling to gunfire, but to the sky itself. Mustangs vanished from screens not because they were shot down, but because they ran out of fuel, got lost, or ditched in the sea. One pilot, Lawrence Grennan, bailed out after exhausting his fuel, later rescued by U.S. forces. Dozens of others weren't so fortunate. Scattered formations meant the few Japanese fighters, still airborne, suddenly had chances they hadn't seen in months. They pounced on isolated Mustangs, finally fighting one-on-one instead of against disciplined swarms. Even then, the Mustang's speed and climb saved many, but not all. The day ended with one of the heaviest American losses of the campaign, yet not at the hands of the enemy. For American pilots, Black Friday became a bitter lesson. Mastering range and technology didn't mean mastering the weather. The Pacific's skies were as lethal as any Japanese ace. For the defenders, it was a fleeting moment of relief, proof that even the invincible enemy could bleed. But deep down, everyone knew the truth. Weather might win a battle, but it would not win the war. The Mustangs would be back. After April 7th, the air war over Japan no longer resembled the campaigns of the past. The Mustangs weren't just escorts anymore. They became predators, and the skies themselves became American territory. What began as a defensive role quickly evolved into offensive sweeps, with P-51 pilots using their range and speed to hunt targets before the bombers even arrived. Airfields that once gave Japanese defenders their edge were now turned into targets themselves. Mustang groups swept low, strafing runways, tearing through parked aircraft, and ripping apart hangars. Factories that somehow survived B-29 firebombing runs were raked with machine gun fire. Rail lines, supply depots, and even fishing boats became vulnerable. For the first time, Japanese civilians looked up not just to see bombers overhead, but fighters circling freely, unchallenged. The psychological impact was enormous. Generations had been told the homeland was sacred, protected by divine forces and geography. Now, American fighters roamed as they pleased. To civilians, the sight of a Mustang streaking over a town or strafing a train was more terrifying than a bomber formation. Bombers meant fire from the sky. Fighters meant the enemy could reach anywhere, anytime, with precision. Strategically, the shift was devastating. Before the arrival of escorts, bomber losses were significant, forcing American planners to balance how much destruction they could risk. But with Mustangs clearing the skies, B-29s could fly missions with far greater confidence. Japanese interceptors became rarer, and when they did appear, their survival chances were slim. Every sweep eroded the remaining strength of Japan's air defense, not just by killing planes, but by killing the idea that resistance could still work. By mid-1945, the daylight skies no longer belonged to Japan. They belonged to the Mustangs and the bombers they shepherded. And every passing week, the imbalance widened. Behind the grand strategies and statistics, the war in the air was also about human endurance. For Mustang pilots, every mission began with a kind of private negotiation. Could they really fly 8 hours in a cramped cockpit, much of it over empty ocean, and still fight when they arrived? The silence over the Pacific was crushing. Nothing but the hum of the Merlin engine, the endless horizon, and the ticking thought that one mechanical failure meant a grave beneath the waves. Pilots described the mental toll vividly. Some admitted the fear wasn't combat itself. It was the hours before combat, staring at the sea, knowing help was too far away if something went wrong. Drop tanks jettisoned, fuel gauges falling, sweat stinging in the mask. It all weighed on them long before Japanese fighters appeared. The mental strain was as much a weapon as bullets. For Japanese pilots, the headset carried different burdens. Intercepts were short, brutal, and increasingly hopeless. Many knew they were flying machines built from substandard materials, powered by unreliable engines. Yet they strapped in anyway. Radios filled with frantic calls, orders to ram or last goodbyes. For young recruits, sometimes barely trained, it was baptism by fire with almost no chance of survival. Captured pilots revealed the confusion and disbelief on the Japanese side. They couldn't understand how Mustangs had reached their skies. Veterans like Saburo Sakai later recalled the shock of seeing American fighters over the homeland itself. It wasn't just another enemy. It was proof that Japan's defenses, built on myth as much as strategy, had been pierced. On both sides, men barely out of their teens carried memories that never left them. The Mustang's range was measured not just in miles, but in the psychological reach it extended. Every contrail written across Japanese skies was also etched into the minds of those who fought beneath them. By the summer of 1945, the Japanese air defense system had all but collapsed. What once filled the skies with determined interceptors now faded into scattered, desperate sorties. Fuel reserves were nearly gone, spare parts were almost impossible to find, and many of the nation's best pilots were already dead. The few who remained often flew outdated machines patched together with wood and fabric, running on fuel so poor it cut engine power in half. Against sleek Mustangs rolling in from Iwo Jima, they stood little chance. For American aviators, the transformation was striking. Missions that began as dangerous gambles across the Pacific slowly became routine. Escort duties gave way to offensive sweeps, rail lines shredded, factories smashed, and airfields left in smoking ruin. The Mustangs weren't just bodyguards anymore. They were the sharp end of a campaign designed to choke Japan's war machine into silence. Japanese commanders saw the writing on the wall. Reports filtered in of squadrons failing to launch, of pilots ordered to fight without enough fuel to return. The once feared Zero was now a relic, its reputation undone by relentless losses. Even the newer George and Frank fighters, impressive on paper, couldn't appear in the numbers needed to make a difference. Each time a Japanese unit tried to rise, Mustangs and bombers swept it aside. For civilians, the psychological blow was even deeper. They had been told the homeland was sacred, beyond reach, defended by divine winds and unbreakable courage. But now they looked up and saw contrails arching across the sky, foreign fighters flying freely where none had dared before. It was more than defeat, it was disillusionment. By August, resistance was a shadow. American pilots shifted their focus to preparing for invasion, destroying whatever remained of Japan's ability to wage war from the air. Losses still came. Engines failed, weather struck, and some never returned. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. For many Japanese aces who survived, the sight of P-51 Mustangs over Tokyo became the moment they truly understood the war was lost. The legacy of those missions went far beyond the Pacific. They proved that range and logistics could redraw the boundaries of war. No homeland was safe, no distance too far. And for the young men who flew those sorties, both American and Japanese, the memory of April skies over Mount Fuji, filled with contrails and gunfire, would mark the end of an era. The invulnerable homeland was gone. The modern battlefield would now span the globe.